Welcome to Never Mind the Dam Busters, the podcast that dives deep into the fascinating, complex and often controversial history of our RAF Bomber Command in the Second World War. I'm Jane Gulliford-Lowes, and alongside my co-host James Jeffries, we're here to move beyond the headlines, the black and white movie myths and the well-worn legends, to uncover the real stories, hard choices and moral questions behind one of the most formidable forces of the war. Each episode will take you inside the missions that shaped a generation, the people who flew them, the strategics that guided them, and the cutting-edge technology that changed the face of warfare. We'll explore a legacy that's still being debated and redefined to this day. Never Mind the Dam Busters isn't just a podcast about bombs and bombers. It's about the human cost, the political pressure, and the power of the air war to shape the modern world. So buckle up and join us as we chart a course through the turbulent skies of history and challenge everything you thought you knew about Bomber Command. Now, unfortunately, James can't join us today as he's having a few technical issues, so I'll be conducting this episode solo. Today, we are delighted to welcome Adrian Bean to the show. Adrian is a writer and director with many years' experience in theatre, radio and television, along with a passion for military history and in particular Second World War aviation. 30 years ago, he directed the groundbreaking real-time radio drama Bomber for BBC Radio 4, which was an adaptation of Len Deighton's fictional novel. It had an incredible cast, including Sam West, Emma Chambers, Jack Shepherd, and also Frank Windsor as Sir Arthur Bomber Harris, along with powerful narration by Tom Baker, the legend that is Doctor Who. It's, for us, the most standout drama to examine the bombing war. The addition of interviews with veterans on both sides, as well as voices from the ground, made it absolutely incredible. If you haven't heard it by now, folks, please do try it and have a listen to it. Recently, Adrian has moved on to writing fiction and non-fiction, focusing on Bomber Command from a variety of perspectives. Adrian's written a book of short stories called Elferlanc, which we've both been reading recently. And again, we really recommend this. Yeah, and we'll chat a little bit about this over the course of this episode. Adrian has also published a non-fiction book entitled What Happened, about a mid-air collision which occurred in 1941, which came about because of a family connection to the crash, which again we'll discuss later on. Now, Adrian is currently writing a novel based on the experiences of German prisoners of war who underwent denazification in the years after World War II. That's an absolutely incredible CV. So, Adrian, welcome to the show, and we're very excited to have you as a guest. How are you?
I'm fine. Very, very good. Thank you. And I'm delighted to be on the show.
So, Adrian, I'd like to begin by discussing the radio adaptation of Len Deighton's Bomber, which I know is one of James' favourite Bomber Command books, and which featured in our last episode, Desert Island Books. So how did the radio version come about, and what do you think were the particular challenges of adapting the book for radio?
Well, there were huge challenges in adapting it, not least of which is it's, as you know, a very expansive book, although the actual story is just about the build-up to the operation over Altgarten and then the fallout from that. Deighton's way of writing, which we all love, is to examine every single detail, everything that's involved in the operation and looking at the story from so many different perspectives, those of the people loading the bombs onto the aircraft, the people planning the operation, the people ringing around stations and informing squadrons where they're going tonight. And then, as you say, the people on the ground who are on the receiving end of the bombing operation, plus very, very beautifully observed characterizations for all of those people. It's absolutely massive. When it came to Radio 4, it came to the BBC via a guy called Jonathan Ruffle, who was a radio producer, as I was at the time. But he was working for Radio 1, so he was producing the likes of Simon Bates and people like that, but was an absolute aviation nut and loved Bomber, which I didn't know at the time. I hadn't read it. But I had a bit of a reputation within the radio drama department for being interested, as you say, in sort of military history and particularly aviation. And I'd done a few productions which went into that area. I'd done an adaptation of Neville Shute's Pastoral, which was about a Wellington Corps. I'd also done a production about the disappearance of Glenn Miller in 1944, and ran that alongside a story about a B-17 crew heading home. And so when Jonathan turned up at the department and said, "This is what I think you should make we should do an adaptation of this," they immediately came to me because there was nobody else really in the department who, quite honestly, would be interested in doing anything like that. And what we have to remember is that 30 years ago was actually quite a different time in the media when it comes to things like military history. Now you turn on television and you can't, every time you change channels, you find another very good drama or documentary or film about some aspect of military history. In the mid-90s, when we made Bomber, that wasn't the case. And in fact, it was almost opposite. There was an antipathy towards military subjects. There was a suspicion about them, and anybody wanting to make programs about the war or anything sort of like that was kind of regarded with suspicion or a bit of derision. Anyway, we managed to... Sorry, go on.
I was going to say that not just in terms of the story itself, but also the sound design must have been quite a challenge as well, because there's so many different perspectives, I think, and different stories that are being told within the main story.
That's right. I suppose the first decision that we had to come to was how we were going to tell the story. We thought, even though quite a large amount of the story had to end up on the floor in the adaptation, we wanted to cover as much as Deighton did. There were lots of different perspectives, as you say. In radio, it's harder in a sense to tell stories when you've got a large cast and lots of implications, because you've got to make each of them distinctive and allow the listener to be able to recognize them, to know where they are in the story and in the world of the drama. So yes, we made an early decision that we would be as faithful as we could to the subject and try not to be, we wanted to be quite sort of documentary.
Yes.
In the approach. That involved getting lots and lots of very, very, very real, authentic, realistic background sound recordings. And we were lucky enough to get up in the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight Lancaster. And
wow.
Because we knew we were spending a lot of time with the crew, with several crews on several different Lancasters. We wanted to get that sense of what it was like for a crew up them. So we went on flights with our sound engineer and recorded just what it was sounding like in the turret, where the pilot and the engineer sat, and the middle of the turret, the rear turret, and what it was like, and listening to different perspectives so that we could move around inside the aircraft when the various characters were talking to each other and get a sense of where they'd be. So particularly for our tail end Charlie, who was the rear gunner, Flash Gordon, when we recorded it, he very cleverly decided that he wanted to be separated from everybody else, the actor playing Flash. So we sat him at one end of the studio, couldn't see anybody, which is exactly the kind of situation that a rear gunner would be in. All he heard for the entirety of the recording was his crew's voices, but he couldn't see them. He just had to listen to what they were saying and the reverse. And we also resorted to the tried and tested sort of, slightly comic way of recording voices over intercoms, which was to use a polystyrene cup.
Yes.
That worked really well. There's nothing better than a polystyrene cup. What we did discover was that it was very difficult for actors who haven't remembered their lines, because they don't learn lines when they're making the radio. They read from the script, obviously because they're not being seen, but very difficult to do that and hold a paper cup over your mouth. So he designed a special, unique headset which allowed them to have the paper cup directly over their mouth and allow them to read their script. And it was slightly comic at first, but it took us 2 weeks to record the whole thing. So by the time we were actually getting anywhere near recording the elements of the raid, the actors were completely relaxed. They knew exactly, they just didn't even think about having these paper cups in front of their mouths, and they were focused on what their characters were doing, and it meant a kind of realism and an authenticity to it, which I think was good. The other thing we did was we made the decision to record it to broadcast it in real time, which firstly made it an event, which was great because it meant that we got a terrific audience. We were able to broadcast from early in the morning at breakfast time all the way through to 12:30 the following night. We played around a little bit with times for the setting off and the return, but we found some existing cases of raids that had taken off at the times we needed them, our aircraft to take off. They would fly away and then we would come back to them 2 hours later whilst they were mid-operation. Then we'd play all of that for an hour and a half. Then we would leave them and we would come back to them in the half an hour or so that it took the aircraft to return to their base, station, sorry. So it was hard work, but it was very exciting and very different. And it's incredible, really, to think that so many people are still listening to it.
Well, that's what I was about to say. It's sort of become an absolute classic. I know it was on BBC Sounds again not too long ago. And it's something which has really sort of held up and stood the test of time, hasn't it?
It has, and I think that's mainly down to Deighton's approach to the subject, which is to be scrupulously accurate, researched, and honest. And I think I could be wrong, I can't think of many other novels that did the same sort of thing at the same time, but I think it was the first novel really that took that kind of documentary approach to the subject of war, and certainly of the bomber offensive, and tried to, and did it very successfully, look at the subject honestly, and really sort of not try to take sides, but to just explore the situation, explore the stories, explore where the different sides are coming from in as honest and truthful a way as possible. Now, that's very dramatic. It's naturally dramatic because you will spend, a scene with a bomber crew, and you're feeling for what they're going through, and then you'll cut to the people down on the ground, or the rescue teams that are trying to rescue, or put out fires, or the people that are staying at home, the WAFs back at the station, waiting for the call sign to say that a particular aircraft is coming back. So that inevitably, that just makes it incredibly dramatic, and radio was the perfect medium for that. But since then, it's become the kind of the go-to approach really for trying to make good dramas about the war.
Yeah, it was absolutely groundbreaking. It really was. I'd like to move on to your writing now, Adrian, in particular the book of short stories, Elferlanc. There's a bit of a story here, isn't there, about how you came about these stories and meeting a former WAF who gave you the information. Can you tell us about the background to Elferlanc?
Yes, fascinating, really. I was working on another book, which actually at the time I didn't know was going to be a book. I was just doing some research. I'm sure we'll go on to talk about that. But whilst I was doing the research into that story, I put out a lot of feelers for people who might be able to give me information to help me with that research. It centered around RAF Syerston, which is or was an RAF bomber station in Nottinghamshire, which is very close to where I grew up and where I currently live. And I got a note from somebody who called herself Ivy, who said that she'd been stationed at Syerston in 1942 and was working as a WAF there in communications. And luckily, I decided to meet her because the subject that I was researching, actually the story I was researching, happened in 1941. So I knew that she wouldn't be able to directly help me with any particular elements of the story, but I thought I can't resist the temptation or the opportunity to go and chat to her. So she was obviously getting on in years, and she was nearly 100, and we had a lovely afternoon chatting. She told me a lot about her time at not only at Syerston, but at other stations when she was working as a WAF. And she was a wonderful character. She was very definitely of that greatest generation. And she had a very strong sense of duty, I suppose. She was very careful about what she told me. She was, one of those people who still believed that having signed the Official Secrets Act, you had to be very careful about what she said. But she was able to sort of share a few stories with me about things that had happened during the time that she'd been stationed. Anyway, we came to the end of our tea together, and as I was heading out, she called me back and disappeared upstairs and came down eventually with a shoebox. It's like a shoebox, small cardboard box, which she gave to me, and she said I could do whatever I wanted to with this. It was mine to take away. And it was just full of papers. I didn't look at it properly until sometime later because I was busy with other things. But when I did, I opened it up, I discovered that there were typescripts in there of typescripts of stories. They were all anonymous. There was no name attached to any of them. And I say all, there was about half a dozen stories. And when I read them, I discovered they were all stories about life on a bomber station, which was presumably could have been RAF Syerston, could have been another one. I had no clue as to who'd written them or what had happened to them, because, as I say, there were no names attached. True to life, very well observed, and I thought just very authentic. And so they could have been written by Ivy herself. Sure, she would have been able to have written the stories having experienced what she had, which was being the person who was meeting bomber crews, knowing them personally, going through that awful experience of having to wait for them to come back. Very often they didn't come back, developing those very intense short-term relationships with boys who might not come back, who she might never see again. And also having a perspective on the other elements of life on the station. So these stories covered they weren't just about the bomber crews, they weren't about the sort of the Wilcom boys or any of that, although they featured it. They were more about the kind of the people who had different jobs on the stations, people who served tea in the naffy wagon, the guys and the girls who drove the tractors to take the bomb trolleys to the aircraft. And so I thought, well, obviously my first thought was I need to do something with these, but nobody was interested in them. I managed to, I sort of put them out there and no one was interested in them. And as I was working towards publication of the story that I was also researching at the time, I thought, well, I'll put them together and put them out there. So I had a story of my own, which was about a Lancaster, which I added to them. And the stories were all about a Lancaster squadron, and published it and called it Elferlanc, which was a sort of a nod to one of my favorite authors, who was Janusz Meissner, the Polish author who used to write under the name of Flight Lieutenant Herbert. And he wrote a couple of books, one called Elferlucy and one called, the name of the other one now, which were about Polish bomber squadrons flying Wellingtons.
Right.
So it was a fascinating sort of story, really, to
it is.
Found them.
The background itself makes it a fantastic story, doesn't it? I've just recently started reading Elferlanc, and as you point out in the introduction, it's not about daring do, and there's not many descriptions of events in the air. It's mainly stories from the ground, and it's about people, isn't it? And there are some very incredibly powerful moments. I've just read the short story at the end of the tour this afternoon, and I have to say it had me in absolute bits. It really did. It's one of the most powerfully written short stories I think I've ever read. And it raises themes of morality, and there are other stories about ground crews and superstitions, etc. And it's all very, very highly thought-provoking. Was that what stood out for you in this writing too, Adrian? Also sort of the commentary on the morality and the opening question of the bombing that's prevalent throughout, and the frequently raised topics of death. They're very powerful pieces, aren't they?
They are, and you get the sense that these are written by people who, or someone who was, these were, even if they weren't discussed openly, these were questions which I think would have been on people's minds. You know, the fact that there was so much killing power, as it were, involved in the kind of bomb loads that were being taken over Germany. It wasn't really the place of crews or admin staff to ask questions about why they were doing what they were doing. Everyone was sort of together in that. But then they would ask questions about why some of the crews didn't return, what happened, and superstitions would arise, and questions would be asked about the morality and the rights and wrongs of what they were doing. A bomber station is as anyone who's worked on one will know, is a very intricately related group of people. Everyone depends on everybody else for their efficiency and their effectiveness and their survival very often. You know, ground crews have a possessive attitude towards the aircraft that they have.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
The aircrew to go away in. Those aircrew are absolutely dependent on the ground crews. There is a story in there about a member of the ground crew who finds himself unable to sleep because he's convinced that something he's done, which might not be mechanical, but something that he has done has caused the bad luck, which has resulted in the death of a crew member. And it's painful, it's agonizing, because you can imagine what it must be like when you're in that situation when, daily you're dealing with the death of people that you know.
Yeah.
Your responsibilities are not just simple responsibilities, they're all about life and death. That must have been a huge burden for people to have to deal with, but they couldn't really talk about it. They weren't in a position to share that necessarily with other people. And, as we know, and Bomber was was kind of taken up by this subject. Lack of moral fibre, something which people were always very afraid of being accused of, and because of the very stringent punishments that were thought about if anyone was found to be lacking in moral fibre. So yes, people would keep those ideas, those thoughts, those worries, those suspicions, those anxieties to themselves, and probably just have to live with them in their dreams. The things they were worried about and having to were unable to talk about would be completely the other way around. There's a moment in one of the stories, I think it could be even the end of the tour, I'm not sure, where one of the characters is talking about the fact that at the debrief, they're talking about the technical things which happened on the op. How many bombs were dropped, how close to the how long it took to get back and what the crosswinds were like. Whereas in fact, what that crew member wants to talk about was what it was like to be in the aircraft looking down at the city boiling beneath them, or to talk about what it was like to suddenly find that the crew member next to them had lost a limb or was dead. And those things couldn't be discussed, couldn't be shared, and probably were kept private unto themselves, possibly for years and years after the war. So yes, they're very moving, they're very powerful stories, and you get the sense that they're very much about what it was like to live on a basis.
Yeah, they are. They're absolutely wonderful stories. And that takes us nicely onto your non-fiction book, What Happened. How did that book come about, and can you share a little of your research journey with us?
Yes, this is the book that I was researching, or the story that I was researching. I had no idea that it was going to be a book initially when I met Heidi. So it all started quite by accident 2 or 3 years ago, not long after COVID, after the lockdown. And I was in the car with my mother, who's getting on in age, and we happened to drive past RAF Syston. And apropos of nothing at all, she just said, "Oh, RAF Syston, that's where your Uncle George's brother died during the war." Now, I'd never heard of my Uncle George's brother. I didn't know he had a brother. And I certainly didn't know that he'd died in an accident, or however he died, at RAF Syston. And I would certainly, give my interest in aviation and things like that, I would certainly have found out about it if I had known. So this intrigued me straight away. And I very quickly started to see if I could find out what had happened. Now, I have an interest verging on obsession about Bomber Command, but I have absolutely no experience or skill in doing research on the subject. Kind of research involved in finding out about individuals who were in the service, their service careers, all of that kind of thing. I know there are people out there who, given the starting point that I had, would have solved the mystery within probably 72 hours. And it took me the best part of 2 years to work out everything. But I simply wanted to find out who my Uncle George's brother was and what had happened to him and when. And that was it. And as I started to Google and find posts here and there, I was set on a journey which really was all about just opening doors and finding out things, and at each door I was very, very surprised and shocked by the things I was discovering, about how the accident that he was involved in, where it happened, who was involved in it. And it's not giving anything away to say that I discovered that my uncle was a pilot under training. He was based at RAF Norton at the time, not at Syston, but he was on a navigation flight around the country, and his aircraft, which was an Airspeed Oxford, was in collision with a Wellington flying from RAF Syston, which was crewed by an all-Polish crew from 305. And that was a shock to suddenly see that it wasn't just my uncle who died.
Gosh, yeah, I can imagine.
But that actually 8 people had died in this collision. And so I suppose I just wanted to keep finding out more. I wanted to find out who these people were, who the co-pilot in the Oxford was. I happened upon the graves of the Polish crew who were all buried at the Polish War Cemetery in Newark, where I live. So that was quite a moving event to actually sort of go and see them all buried together, and just a few feet away from one of the crew members of the Oxford. And I was trying to find out, I suppose, I don't know why, I just wanted to find out where it all happened. And I suppose all I wanted to do was to find out where the crash had happened, where the aircraft had landed up. And I, through a lot of coincidences and dead ends, mistakes, naive dead ends, I eventually did find not only the place where the Wellington landed or ended up, which was just happened to be very, very close to where I grew up. And in fact, I passed the actual spot hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times in my life, both as a kid and as an adult. But there was no record of this accident having happened. And then also the spot where the Oxford came down, both very close to each other. And I met an awful lot of really interesting people in the course of the research. Aside from Heidi, I actually met a chap who lived in a nearby village who had visited the site of the accident the day after.
Oh, wow.
To try and find bullets. He was the man who actually took me to the spot. I was able to show that in the absence of having the actual RAF map, which would have given me the exact coordinates. I didn't find out much later. But as I went through the various casualty files and operational logs of the squadrons, I just found out so much information and wanted to find out more that I found myself writing all of this down, and it became a book. It just became a book by accident. Part of the book was also about how I was sort of, as well as finding out the story, I was examining my own reasons for obsessing about trying to find out what had happened. I mean, I could easily have just given up after an early stage, or been satisfied with what I found out, which was the name and the date of, the people who died. But I wanted to find out more. And so the book, in the end, became a kind of what I call a creative non-fiction, because as well as exploring everything about the build-up to and the incident itself and the fallout from it, I'd learned so much about the characters and where they were all coming from, particularly the Polish crew, and I managed to make contact with the descendants of one of the crewmen who live in England now, and talk with them and see how emotional they were about my discoveries. Then I started to fictionalize, based on my research, the story of that day. So it's pretty much the same way as Deighton sort of takes lots of different perspectives in Bomber. I was doing the same thing. So I hope, and I hope it's been successful in that, because I was really quite struck and quite moved by how you can find that a simple name on a piece of paper is one thing. To start to find out all the details about what happened and why it happened and what was build up to it, and the characters and what they were thinking of, and then what was going through their lives, the relationships they were having. All of that just became a story, really.
Yeah. This sounds.
I actually found out what happened.
This sounds very similar to the sort of journey that I embarked upon when researching my uncle's story as well. It becomes an obsession, doesn't it? It really does. I know from my own experiences when researching and writing about his crew in Above Us the Stars, the Halifax crew, what an emotional journey it can be when writing about a family member, or even just you begin to feel like that these crew members personally, don't you? Because you spend so much time researching sort of every detail of their lives that you feel like you come to know them. And I think I spent almost 2 years sort of sobbing at very regular intervals when I wrote that book. And I was actually emotionally exhausted at the end of it. I didn't write anything again for ages afterwards. I just couldn't do it. I didn't have it in me. How did you sort of approach that aspect of it? And do you think having such an emotional attachment to your subject helps or hinders writers?
Oh, I mean, yes, it's incredibly important, and I hadn't expected it, because, as I say, the man whose death I was investigating, William Parkinson, was not a blood relative. He was the twin brother of an uncle of mine by marriage,
right?
Related by blood. And it was, as I say, it was kind of like an intellectual investigation to begin with. It was just a problem that I wanted to solve. And then the more I discovered about the story, the more obsessed I became. And that was partly to do with the emotional elements of it. And I was fascinated by the coincidences that have been coming up, the kind of the places I was going to. There were places I'd grown up in and I hadn't realized. But more importantly, for me, there was a kind of a therapy involved, because I'd recently come out of a divorce, and I was trying to work out, and this will sound trite by comparison to the subject that I'm talking about, but I was trying to work out who I was and where I was going and where I was feeling very sort of lost and lonely, in a sense. And reading the stories about the people who had been involved in this subject was incredibly grounded and humbling, because what I'd been through was nothing by comparison to what they'd been through. And then I was also encountering, as I say, the people who did have a blood relationship with the people who had died. And the Polish man, Paul and Piotr Petrozak, who live in the northwest. This was incredible. When I'd been taken to the spot where the Wellington came down and burned, I actually found a handful of 303 bullets, both the casings and the actual lead bullets. At the spot. So, and I was able to hand these to Paula in her flat. These were the bullets that had been on the aircraft that her great uncle had died on. And that was really, really incredible. That was an incredible moment, really, because he was someone, Jerzy Kroczek was someone who the family had talked about in hushed tones for decades. he was a hero. He was someone who had lived an amazing life and a tragic death. I was able to put something or connect the only physical connection that could possibly be made, other than his grave, which they visit, on the kitchen table, and that was really quite powerful. And yes, it becomes very emotional, and you get upset, and you start to think, when you start to question your obsessions and your worries and your day-to-day fears and anxieties, and you put them into this context, and you realize that actually sometimes they're not about the life you're going through is not as difficult as a whole generation of thing called the cat and live. So that sounds very trite. It's not about a good way of explaining it, but it's, I know what you mean when you say that you're digging up evidence and stories which have huge immediacy and I think emotional immediacy, because you can't help but think about the individuals and the real people behind various states and drive and technical plans.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you feel that you, in researching and writing the book, do you feel that you reached the resolution that you were hoping or looking for in going through that process, in terms of the story that you were uncovering?
Yes, I mean, I got very upset because I thought, after all the work that I'd been doing, I thought I wasn't actually going to find the one spot, which was the spot where the airspeed ox was going out, and because the guy Walter Brown, who sadly died only a few months ago, who took me to the spot where the Wellington came out, knew that he knew the field where the Oxford would come out, but he wasn't allowed to go in and see the site because the farmer was so terrified. So I had an idea of where it would be, and I couldn't judge it exactly. I tried to work out on my own sort of simple way, by deduction, where that would be. And then it was a stroke of luck. I managed to get this copy of this special map. I'd got the Air 81 casualty model, which had the coordinates of both crash sites on it, but they related to a special unique map, which was called Sheet 54. This was the maps that the Bomber Command issued. They mapped out, obviously, the whole of Great Britain, but it didn't relate to the Ordnance Survey or anything like that. It was their own map. So I couldn't find out where the Oxford had come down until I had a copy of the map. And luckily, I managed to, right at the last minute, get hold of a copy of the map, and it turned out that the spot where the Oxford came down was a matter of yards away from where I'd calculated it. It could have.
Really? Wow. So
I was able to find it. I'm now in discussions with some people, some lovely people in the village over which the collision happened, and we're now investigating the possibility of getting a memorial erected in the village church to the crews of both aircraft. I feel good about that. That's good, because this wasn't even a footnote in history, this accident. It happened relatively early on in the war. It was an accident. It was, it wasn't on an operation. It just happened to be two aircraft that crashed in broad daylight. Nobody was blamed for it. It was just one of those things that happened. But it was the death of 8 men, and they all had families. This is all I forgot. Hopefully that's all now. If you remember.
I've just been through a similar thing myself with regard to a memorial in my village where I live in the northeast of England to a Canadian bomber crew who crashed in October 1984 just in the fields a couple of miles away during just a training accident that they were flying a Whitney, and it just disintegrated in midair, sadly. But yeah, I sort of researched their story, and I can understand entirely where you're coming from in terms of the resolution that you feel personally once that memorial is in place. I think it's almost as if you've sort of brought that chapter to a close, if you like. Yes, I do know exactly where you're coming from. I'm also intrigued to hear more about your latest project, which is, I believe, a novel about denazification. Can you tell us a little more about that too?
I'm fascinated by this subject. For anyone who does that, there were about 500,000 German prisoners of war in Great Britain in 1945 at the end of the war. And in the months towards the end of the war, when it was clear that not Germany was going to surrender and that there would have to be some sort of return of these prisoners to Germany, it became very clear that you couldn't just send a whole load of die-hard Nazis to Germany. That would just be a recipe for chaos. So the British and American governments instituted something which is quite new. It was a process which they call Denazification. When Germans and Italians were captured, they were immediately classed as being, according to how an interrogator would regard their security risk. So if they were a diehard Nazi, which usually meant someone who was either a member of the SS or the U-boat crew or maybe a paratrooper, they would be held separately, by and large, not always, from other prisoners who were regarded as a risk, and then other prisoners who were what were called the white prisoners. They were black, grey, and white. The white prisoners who were regarded as not being a risk, but they were people who just happened to have been drawn into the war by conscription or whatever. Now, the situation in prison war camps was, very quite chaotic. These to a certain extent, prisoners were largely left to run the camps themselves. I know they had their own sort of system of organisation, but when it time came to send them back again, because they had to decide how they were going to evaluate who could go back, when they could go back, and whether a sort of re-education plan was. So people were recruited by the government to interview prisoners, talking about the die-hard Nazis, and find out what they thought, because we were talking about a generation of people who were brought up knowing only the Nazis, but they didn't know about democracy. They had no idea about any other way of living other than what they'd known growing up as boys and Hitler youth and Hitler. And so this process of trying to re-educate them by introducing them to ideas of democracy and freedom and discussion, and trying to change their mindset in order to be able to allow them to go back to Germany and help them build up a new Germany. Was undertaken. This was undertaken again. It was extensive. It was quite detailed about the region. So what I've tried to do, what I'm trying to do is to look at this from the point of view of a prisoner inside who is undergoing initially very resistance to emotion, that he should be regarded as someone who had been brainwashed and was going to be unbrainwashed. See that through the eyes of a descendant, a granddaughter going back to England to visit the prison camp where they stay. So it's interesting to sort of look at a relatively unknown area of military history.
Yeah, that sounds absolutely fascinating. And how far are you on with that project?
Through a first draft, and inevitably when you get to the end of your first draft, that's when you look at it and go, oh, I know, I have to rewrite this.
Yeah.
I've got a lot of work to do on it, but I think it holds out. I'm pleased with the research that I've done on the subject, and I'm pleased with the characters that I've developed. And I'm pleased because I think it's, as I say, it's a relatively unknown area, really. We all know about prisoners of war, and we've all watched Cold Bits and films from the other point of view as well. But to actually sort of look at it from the point of view of the Germans, and we always we watched The Great Escape, and we watched The Wooden Horse and all of those films. And they're from the point of view of prisoners who are trying to escape back to a country which is ultimately going to win the war. And the Germans were going back to a country that had been defeated, and everything they believed in had been defeated. And they probably didn't have families to go back to, or home, and certainly off jobs. Their whole worldview had changed. And that's a very, very, I think, very interesting, very, very difficult experience.
Absolutely. That sounds absolutely intriguing. Does it have a title yet, or a working title?
It does. It's called The Pure Fool, which is a reference to Parsifal, the opera by Wagner, which was coincidentally, I think, Hitler's favourite of Wagner's operas. It refers to, I tried to draw parallels with what happened to young men and women in the 1930s in Germany, who were treated rather like fools, and their innocence was exploited by the Nazis. They were used and abused by them, turned into weapons, I suppose. And one of the themes that runs through the book is about music, how music relates to, how music is a very interesting way of looking at people's experience of war. A lot of the stories in Elferlanc have music running through them, and people remember their experiences very often. They're triggered by music, or music helps to train the way that they remember things or understand things. And that was certainly, I think, an experience of young people growing up in Nazi Germany, who would be being exposed to military music, which is exciting, which is
very much so. Very stirring.
The music of violence is stirring and stirs up all kinds of emotional things within them which relate to what the Nazis were talking about and their strange perverted worldview about where Germany was destined to go. So you can see how music was used by the Nazis, some of the things, and how music also helps to uncover memories that people have on the war, and things which possibly they don't want to remember can be triggered by hearing music, and music can help to explain things which they possibly don't necessarily understand at the time.
Well, having read the other two of your books, I'm very much looking forward to this one. I think it will be a real treat, and please do keep us in the loop about when it's published. That's sadly all we've got time for this evening. Thank you so much for joining me, Adrian. It's been absolutely wonderful chat. It's wonderful to have you on the show. We'll definitely have to have you back on again, because I think there are so many things that we could have talked about this evening and gone down so many other different rabbit holes as well. So thank you so much for your time, and thank you for joining us. So next week we celebrate the 50th episode of Nevermind the Dam Busters. That's incredible, really, as we only ever meant to do 6. We're delighted that the friend of the show, Dr. Dan Eldon, will be joining us to discuss, drum roll, the legacy of the Dam Busters. Yes, we finally got around to discussing Operation Chastise and its military and cultural repercussions. And that episode will be available on early access to our subscribers on Saturday the 9th of August and to everyone else on Wednesday the 13th of August. If you're enjoying the show, why not help us spread the word? A quick star rating or review on your favourite podcast platform goes a long way. It helps more curious minds like yours discover Nevermind the Dam Busters. It really makes a massive difference to those algorithms. And if you'd like to go one step further, you can support the show for just £2.40 or $3 a month. It's a small contribution that makes a big difference. Just hit the link in the show notes or head over to nevermindthedambusters.buzzsprout.com. We'd also love to hear from you. Join the discussion in our Facebook group and follow us on social media to stay in the loop. Thank you so much for listening. Hopefully James will have resolved his technical issues and will be back with us again next week. We'll see you all again soon. Thank you. Goodbye.